very widely, but here we go. There we go. Okay, so let's get started. So this is the beginning of our book study, chapter 1, the first thing. Probably the only chapter of this that I was really even remotely qualified to host. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Steve Dykstra. I'm a psychologist from Wisconsin. I work in the Milwaukee area. I may be the only person on this call who's never actually taught anybody how to read. I'm well known in the reading world. I don't do reading research. I'm known for other things. The biggest thing I'm known for, I think, is saying outrageous things that everybody else thinks but are afraid to say. And I sort of made a reputation for myself that way, but I'm really happy to talk about this. And I'm going to bring in some knowledge from other fields and some ideas about other fields as we go along. So what every teacher needs to know about reading, and if you look at the title of the book next to that, what every secondary school teacher needs to know about reading. And we start out with this question, why? Why does every teacher need to know about reading? So let's go to the next slide. For those of you who read the book, I hope everybody had a chance to read the first chapter. Did anything strike you? Did anything sort of take you by surprise? Did you find yourself nodding your head a lot, saying, that's obvious, everybody should know that? What kind of reaction did people have?
I think for me, it was like the things that you noted as well were these ideas, these reasons what secondary to me is a lost researched area. And having been in secondary personally as a teacher for 17 years, I don't ever feel like there's really strong understanding around the needs of secondary students when it comes to literacy, and then how we support them when their gaps in literacy haven't been addressed until their secondary high school or secondary time. So, and I think of secondary, I do think 7-12. So I don't know, I hope that narrative or that discussion. And I noticed that they were kind of going back and forth with that a little bit between that middle high school. But for me, as I was reading, that was the like, oh yeah, duh. And I had a lot of does more than I had a little ahas.
So Mary Newton is probably on this meeting with us too, another, really driving force behind everything we do in Wisconsin. And I'm going to share a story. She and I, years ago, way back before a lot of things, before we got as deep into this, we were in Madison meeting with a former state senator back when the legislature in Wisconsin was more evenly divided. And this was a Democratic senator from Racine, and I'm from Racine, a guy named John Lehman. And John was a really nice guy. And what's interesting about John is he was a teacher. He was a secondary, middle school and high school teacher. And when he became a state senator, when they were out of session, he would take gigs as a long-term sub in the Racine School District so he could keep his hand in the game. And we were talking to him about these kids. We were talking to him about what happens to these kids when they can't read. And he had this very sort of aha moment right there in front of us. And he was very open about it. And he said, this is really starting to answer some questions for me. These kids I've had in middle school and high school all these years who don't seem to read the assignment, who don't seem to do the work out of the class, outside of class. And I'm wondering now if reading was just so hard for them, they didn't do it. And he said, teachers in middle school and high school, they sort of make up for that. They don't do anything with the reading thing, but he said, we make up for that by we assign the work and then we talk about it in class anyway. We don't really expect too many of the kids to have figured that out for themselves. So we lose a lot of time. There's a lot of things we can't do because we're constantly reteaching what we really wanted everybody to read. And you could see this light go on and be above his head, that all the lots of questions he had were sort of being answered in that moment. And he was reflecting on how many kids he had seen who couldn't read, but he was just oblivious to it. I wonder if there's any, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Thank you for doing this, by the way. I didn't even know about this book, so I'm really excited to be in this book study. But so number 9 on page 29 really hit me. And I've heard these statistics before, but just estimating that 70% of prison populations had difficulty reading and writing. And just
Right.
thinking this is if we're going to fix the broken system, it's going to be teaching these kids to read.
Yeah, I work in the broken system. My regular gig during the day is as a clinical mental health psychologist from Milwaukee County, working with kind of deep end kids. And we all know that a huge percentage of kids who go through children's court who end up in the system struggle with reading. Everybody acknowledges it, but then for the most part, nobody does anything about it. We sort of shrug our shoulders and say, oh, well, all these guys in prison can't read. Oh, well, all these kids in detention can't read. Oh, well, all these kids we sent off to Copper Lake and the different correctional systems for kids, they can't read. Oh, well. And, we don't do anything about it. We just sort of see it as inevitable.
I think
I
what
have a thought
resonated, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I have a thought about this. I'm wondering if we're not using strong enough language. I've been thinking about this lately, where I feel like using the word dyslexia makes it seem as if it's too complex and you need a doctor. And we're not using the strong enough language of illiterate. Like to be illiterate
Yes.
is such strong language. I wish we would start using that word.
And two, they talk about here, though, somewhere, I can't remember where it was, but putting labels on kids and that taking away from the student-centeredness. And so we're putting that blame, it's a student deficit, it's their fault, it's the disability's fault they can't read, it's not my fault. So it's kind of like an excuse. Well, they have dyslexia, I can't teach them.
Yeah, and that really resonates with me. When we're producing illiterate students, if our outcome is illiteracy, that is so that's a piece that really stuck with me.
Yeah, I think that's critically important. Using the right language. This is going to be a little delicate and a little sensitive, and I don't want to trigger anybody or upset anybody, but years ago when I worked in our day treatment program, we would have to send these prior authorizations into Title 19 to get authorization for 6 more weeks of care for these kids or whatever it was. And we found that the ones I wrote were all being approved, and the ones other people wrote were being nickel and dime. We'd ask for 6 weeks, we'd get 3. And we tried to look at what that was. Why was that happening? It was mostly because I used that strong, plain language. When we had kids who had been sexually assaulted, I described them as having been raped. Other people were saying they were molested. It's easier to turn down services for a kid who's been molested than for a kid who's been raped. Now, I'm sorry if that's indelicate and that's a pretty harsh metaphor, but I think that's what's happening. In how many of our school districts respond to dyslexia by saying, oh, that's a medical diagnosis, we have no responsibility for that. But illiteracy, nobody can run in the school system can run from their responsibility for illiteracy. I hope not. I think that's a really important thing. We had a really good question a moment ago, and I'm going to try to look for it. This one from Tammy. I think the phrase language mediates thought resonated with me. Language mediates thought. It's so much bigger than getting through school. It's about having the language skills for critical thinking and accessing the world. God, that's true. I mean, that's so. If you can't think about something unless you have the words to think about it. That's how we think about things. We think about things in words. We need the words. And where are you going to get the words if you can't read? Do you think anybody in the education system really disagrees with this? Or do they just sort of agree with it and then not do anything about it?
I find that in our district, I feel like there is almost a denial that if they don't accept the fact that it's their job to teach reading at whatever content area it is, including language arts.
I have this question down at the bottom here. What do other professions do? Let me tell you something. I think this is a really interesting metaphor. So years ago, people went to school to be doctors, and they went into residency to be doctors, and they wanted to be they wanted to be adult medicine doctors, what we call medicine or internists. They didn't learn anything in their training, for the most part, about cystic fibrosis, because people with cystic fibrosis 20, 40, 50 years ago, sadly, didn't usually live long enough to get to an adult medicine doctor. They were all treated by pediatricians. And then the treatments for cystic fibrosis got better, and these kids were making it into adulthood, and they had to keep going to their pediatricians because they're adult doctors. Nobody in the adult world knew how to treat this. They saw that this wasn't their responsibility. They never treated this before. And, I see some similarity in that, in the sense that way in the past, kids who couldn't read maybe dropped out of school or didn't keep going, or we tracked them into some other branch of education. We gave them, trade classes and that sort of stuff, and it was less important. And so we didn't worry about it. Now we're trying to get everybody ready for a more sophisticated economy. They have to be able to read. It becomes everybody's responsibility. You can't just shovel these kids off to the side. You can't just deflect them into another course of study. It's not going to work that way. For any secondary teachers who are on here, did they teach you much about reading when you were in school, or did you have to figure that out all for yourself?
We
I
had to
want-
figure, go ahead. Go ahead. No, I
No,
was just
Sam, you're up.
Okay, so I am a former secondary teacher, teaching English at the junior high level, and absolutely not. Like I taught that for 16 years. And when I went to college, that reading was definitely not the focus, because my degree was in English. So it was English language arts. And so getting into the classroom and being exposed and having all these different students that have all these different levels and kids that can't read was like eye-opening, because it was like college didn't prepare me for that. And I think on like a different level or a different thought, I think that some kids have the mentality that they don't necessarily need all of the literacy skills in order to be able to make it in the world. Now, as educators, obviously, we know that they do need all the literacy skills, and they do need to be able to be proficient in reading. But a lot of people that necessarily are not on that path to continue their education, to go to college, whatever, they're just gonna like work with their dad at a shop, or they're gonna continue to do whatever. They don't feel like they necessarily need all those skills to be able to make it. And in reality, some of them still can't make it, but obviously they're not going to be as successful as if they had the full literacy.
If I saw a kid in 8th or 9th grade who was like, yeah, it doesn't matter that I can't read because I'm not going to be able to read. Is this a kid who has neglected reading because they know what they want to do in their life and it doesn't involve that much reading? Or is this a kid who realized they couldn't read and so allowed their options going forward to be narrowed down to these few things where reading isn't that important? They want to tell you it's the first one. I'm happy with what's left for me. This is my goal. This is what I want to do. But are they just, in a sense, settling for that because they struggle so much to read?
Well, actually, you're right. They're settling because they don't know how to read.
Right.
What is happening is most people don't realize that reading is not a natural thing for man, and that reading is actually a man-made invention. So if you don't know how the invention works or how the decoding works, it's very hard for even elementary school teachers to teach reading. And it's made an assumption that by 6th grade, you should be able to know how to read or decode in order to be successful. So at 6th grade and on, most people take it that you should know that. And I think, the literacy rate in America has gone down to a point that I think I read something the other day about 47% of all third graders are not reading on grade level, which means how can they be reading in grade level in 6th or 9th grade?
Right. They're not just going to get caught up magically. You know, we're not going to sort of send them our thoughts and prayers and they're going to wake up and they go, wow, I can read. And even if that worked, how much information do they not have? Right. Somebody's saying here, the gap will widen. That's exactly right. The gap is going to widen. The whole notion of the Matthew effect. You know, even if I could pass so this is my magic wand. This is an actual replica magic wand from, can't see it, but from Harry Potter. So this is Snape's wand, to tell you the truth. Even if this thing worked and I could wave it over their heads when they're in 8th grade and make them all read, what gaps in their knowledge base, what gaps in what the things they know about already exist. So they're still behind. You know, just because it's happening late and that's great, they're still behind. And that has a real consequence for them. I should share with you as well that the mental health system of care that I work in for kids that really the most severe in chronic and difficult situations, we've recognized this problem and we're trying to incorporate some basic reading tutoring for our kids. We're not being real successful with the basic tutoring, and I didn't really think we would, but we're starting to screen all our kids for word level reading difficulties. We came upon a 7th grader who had an IEP, and this was not noted in their IEP. He didn't know the whole alphabet. And nobody seemed to know that. Part of that is because he was damn good at keeping that hidden from people. But when we sat down and said, name these letters, he could barely do it.
I
What
worked
chance
with a
did he
9th grade
have?
student. Sorry. I worked with
ahead.
a 9th grade student this year. And he didn't know the difference between his vowel sounds, struggled with that. CVC words were hard to sound out. And whether it was, I think it was both a language issue and just a lack of exposure. He did not know what like nature meant, like little tiny things. He's in 9th grade and he's been kicked out of school how many times? Because every time they try to teach him to read, he escalates and no one
blows up.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I've talked with kids, many of you have done this. I've talked with kids who recount their 500 different skills for getting the attention off of them when somebody's about to discover that they can't read. You know, break my pencil, throw a fit, make myself throw up, say I have to go to the bathroom and not come back, you know, accuse the teacher of something, get myself suspended, walk out. They'll do anything. You know, they'll do absolutely anything. And those skills follow them in the middle school and high school. And they're very aggressive about that. Tell you so these are some little ideas, some things that I think are interesting from other professions. I have a friend of mine from high school who's a physician and he practices in Texas. I looked him up a few years ago. I hadn't talked to him a long time. He's a family medicine doctor, so he doesn't do specialized care, but he was caring for people in very remote areas of Texas. And he had to learn how to do colonoscopies, and he teaches other general practice doctors how to do colonoscopies. Now, if you live in a big city, nobody goes to a general practice or family medicine doctor for their colonoscopy. You go to a specialist. But out in the rural areas where there's fewer practitioners, that specialist might be 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hours away, and people aren't going to do that. You know, they're not going to do that. So they have to get their care from somebody who's there. We don't have as many specialized reading teachers available to us in secondary education. So even in well-staffed and well-funded districts, the responsibility for this is going to fall to general practice teachers. It's going to fall to people who maybe don't think of themselves as reading teachers. You know, I see a lot of kids who take psychiatric medications that are prescribed by their pediatrician because they can't get to a child psychiatrist. So it falls on that general practice person. People need to know about these things so that they can spot these kids and intervene appropriately. That's this idea. It's this all hands on deck shared responsibility that we have. But how do we support, even if everybody agrees that this is a moral duty? I think everybody in this call does. How do we support teachers better? Or they've got their license, they've got their certificate, they're already teaching, they've been doing this for 15 years. How do we support them better to make them more effective at this?
I think you hit a couple things. First of all, the climate and culture of any building system structure is everyone's got to be or the majority need to be rowing in the same direction, and that it's a mission that you actually think you can accomplish, because there's been so much deflecting over the years that they really don't see it as their job. You know, it's like bringing a motorcycle into an auto mechanic. It's like, yeah, just because it has an engine doesn't mean that I can take care of it, right? And so how do we provide them with, look, that just because they're 8 years behind doesn't mean it's going to take 8 years to catch them up, number one.
Right.
What scaffolds can we have in place? And you almost have to give them a vision and a hope, but then that also goes back to who really understands what that vision and hope might look like. In the course of, we're still going to continue to give access to the learning, the content that you're the specialist about. So that sage on the stage kind of professorial type of mentality is hard to get over as well. So those are big things.
Yeah, and you have to be able to notice these things. You have to know enough to realize what you're looking at. You're just like was told before, that is the really excellent comment that the words you have facilitate your thinking, your critical thinking. You have to know enough about reading that you can have appropriate thoughts, that you're not limited to, well, that kid can't read, I bet he's been really lazy about school his whole life. You know, if that's the only explanation your knowledge can summon, you're going to respond differently to these kids than if you say, oh, wait, I think I know what's wrong here.
Rebecca, I love what you said about the kind of like have to give them something to work with and like give that excitement, because I was working today on our high school, our 7 through 12 school action plan around literacy. And we were trying to think of what the core 3 were, but we wanted to make it applicable for secondary teachers in their content, but still relevant. And that's been kind of our big shift, is like to try to row us up, as you use your metaphor, like try to row up towards that direction of like, what are 3 things that we could ask every content to try to implement that would at least start at the instructional level and then work towards the more, or give us insight on the other levels. Because we have testing, secondary schools have testing and have tools that give us what we need, but they also don't know what to do with that information. And so from an instructional lens, that's also what we're looking at, like, what is our data telling us? But then how do we make instructional choices that support content and students who have issues when it comes to reading, either that poor background knowledge, language, vocabulary, executive function issues, the mental health, the SEL stuff. It's so many facets in secondary. Then that's kind of what I keep like pinpointing, is that it's not just one thing. It's not just that they don't know CVC words or their vowels. It's that they've mastered other things. So how does that work? And I think that kind of goes to this tension, and then also what Steve's been talking about, what all of us have been talking about, is that it's so interesting to how does secondary students, and what do secondary students need? And in some ways they need a shift in how content is presented in order to use what they already know.
Do we routinely do any of you come from schools where we're good about making audio versions of textbooks available to kids so they can listen as they read? Are schools largely good about that, or are they just not aware?
I think right now we've adopted a new curriculum, and it is embedded in the new curriculum we're adopting. And Kim can correct me if I'm wrong, because we're in the same district. But then we have other avenues, and we have the ability to do it, but it's getting that information out to teachers. And not only special ed teachers though, but gen ed teachers. And I think that's where the line is that we have it, but not everybody knows about it.
There's immersive reader connected right into, I think it's Google and Word. You can teach the kids so they can use that, and it's free. And I think that even those, just like you said, those resources are right there. But how do we make them aware, and then teachers not see them as like, the teacher that doesn't ever want a child to have a calculator. It's kind of that same thing, that immersive reader is not the calculator. It's something that they could benefit them on picking up the content and building fluency at the same time.
Yeah,
So
they're not, it's not cheating.
right.
It's not cheating. It sort of feels like cheating. And I understand that if I'm teaching, if I'm trying to get a child to read, if I'm sort of right at that level where I'm trying to get them to get a little better at reading, I want to make them engage with the printed text. But if the goal is to just get the information, then we got to use everything available to us to get that information into their head.
I think one thing that resonated with me from this chapter is just how it opened with talking about like language is the opening. I can't remember how they said it, but language, let me read it. Language is the door, reading is the key. And sometimes I think when we go down the science of reading path, it's just been focused on like decoding, phonemic awareness, phonological awareness. It's just been focused on that. And so I think, at least where I am, I think we might be getting over that hump and onto like that language aspect as well. So I work with a pretty large district, and they are really looking at their middle school and high school data as well. And then like, even if we can just get secondary teachers to realize like your goal is that language and vocabulary piece, like we need that help from you as content area specialists or as content area teachers. They're like, that's going to be like our gateway, like work on your vocab, like work on getting that language built in your content areas. And let's see what that can do just as a starting place.
Yeah, we need to pump words into kids' heads, and because of like the Hart and Risley study, we're more conscious than we used to be about the need to sort of pump words into kids' heads when they're little, but we need to keep doing that. We need to keep just getting as many words into these kids' heads, as much knowledge about words into their heads as we possibly can, because those words are going to make them better thinkers. It's going to let them think things they couldn't do otherwise. How do we get administrators to lead the work?
Yeah, I always say at my house, like the word digraph, trigraph, like those are part of our everyday language in my house. I have a 12-year-old, 10-year-old, and 7-year-old, and we just use those words frequently. Like we just talk about digraphs, trigraphs, all the like language, like the reading language. But I'm like, my 7-year-old doesn't know what a quotient is because I just don't talk about that. So that's where
It's not your thing, yeah.
It's not my thing. Like we talk about lots of things, but I'm not going to talk about division every day.
They gotta spend one time per week at their friend's house where their parents are math teachers, and then those kids come over to your house one day a week, make this rotation to hear these words and understand these words. One of the interesting things for me too is the most morphologically rich language that I'm aware of are the technical terms in chemistry, particularly organic chemistry. If you understand the morphology of organic chemistry terms, somebody can give you this long, complex name of a chemical, and you could draw it just from the name if you understood the morphology. It's really interesting. But kids need knowledge. We need to pump that knowledge and pump those words into their head. And that's really hard to do if you can't read, or you find reading painful or upsetting. Like, if you're working so hard to get the word off the page that you don't have anything left to comprehend it, that becomes really, really difficult to do. For those of you who work in secondary school, do you see a lot of readers, or do you think you see a lot of readers who they can decode, but it's still so sort of secretly effortful for them that they have no stamina for reading? And if you tested their reading for 30 seconds or 60 seconds, they might look fine. But if you could test it for 5 or 10 or 15 minutes, they would not look. I was talking to a parent and a teacher one time about a kid, and the teacher said he reads okay, but if he has to read a lot, he starts to sweat. The poor kid is working so hard. There's actually like heat coming off his head. He starts to sweat, and then he feels like he has to take a nap. It's just so exhausting. There is
Yeah,
this tension between being a generalist and being a specialist, you know, people who, and I understand, you make a choice in your career, you say, this is what I do, this is going to be my thing. That's not my thing. Somebody else is going to take care of that. This desire to be a specialist, it's challenging for people. So let me look through the chat because I know there's a lot of good things coming in there. Yeah, Nicole said her 9th and 10th grade students have little to no stamina for reading. And I think that's a shame.
I think that's also kind of why when you look at like your oral reading fluency assessments and like that's going to give you that snapshot. It looks like they're fluent readers, but that doesn't assess stamina. And there's not a lot of things that help us support our struggling readers and their stamina, except with what some would say it's just wide reading. Well, that sucks too. Like for some kids, that's really hard to get them to do what is called wide reading.
Yeah.
To build that stamina. So I keep going back to some of the things Rebecca said. It's like, how do we connect that, bridge that, make that worth it? And maybe it does start with all of the, I know it does start with all of the beginning stuff, but it's very intriguing to me.
Get some great ideas in the chat here.
Agreed.
I see a lot that, and even at the upper elementary, but same with middle school, high school, is that they don't get to full automaticity. So we teach kids the skills, but they're not fully automatic. Therefore, there's not they have to focus so much on decoding that the comprehension gets lost.
Yeah, and you know, like Melanie makes the point here that our technology and YouTube short video culture has not helped with this at all. You know, people are getting their information and they're experiencing things very visual or in really tiny little bites. And that's something that Marianne Wolf talks about, that people may be reading in some sense even more than they did before, but it's very shallow. It's not deep reading. It's not sustained deep reading. And that's a different thing. That's a different skill for the brain to do. And the brain has to do it to get good at it.
I think is an instructional piece that we have to consider is this maybe shorter text, but revisiting them more frequently with more complex sentences and ideas and navigating them in a communal way in a classroom. Yeah. But that takes a skill of setting up a classroom and setting up a community and setting up a culture that is often rare to find.
And it's, you know, it's this constant tension we have, I think, in teaching anything. Do we teach a lot of stuff kind of shallow? Do we teach a very little bit of stuff, but really deeply? Do we do that with vocabulary? Do we do that for other things? I have this a really interesting word for me is perpendicular, and I'll tell you why. When I was in 4th grade, we were reading Heidi by Johann Spiri, you know, the classic book. And my teacher was John Waltenberger, who I saw a few years ago. He was in his 80s, but he was doing great. And I ran into him at a funeral, actually. And I talked to him about this. I was reading that book in class, and there was the word perpendicular, and I had no idea what it meant. And I walked up to him and I said, what does this word mean? He said, perpendicular. And he explained it to me. And every time I see the word perpendicular, every time I use the word perpendicular, I think of him. You know, it is anchored like that in my head. I think of him. And I think of him very fondly for a number of reasons, but that's one of them, that he's in there. I know, you know, he gave me that. And, you know, kids need as many of those as they can get, you know, to absorb these words and understand the world. Krista makes the point that, yeah, these kids are expending so much cognitive energy in decoding, there isn't anything left to comprehend. I compare this sometimes to kids who are just learning to drive. You know, a kid who's just first learning to drive, you don't want no conversation in the car, you don't want the radio on, you want to drive during the day on familiar roads, because you don't want anything to place any extra cognitive demand on them. Just the driving is so hard. You know, they're white knuckling it. You got to peel their fingers off when they get home. But later, when we get better and more fluent at that, we can have a little conversation while we're driving. But then you're driving in the mountains at night in bad weather. Everybody's got to be quiet. Everybody's got to shut up, because this is going to take all of the driver's skill and attention to do this. And, when there's nothing, when it's so hard to decode and to decode quickly enough, there's just nothing left for anything else. There was a study, I don't remember who did it, but they watched kids read, while they used functional MRI to measure the metabolism in their brain. And kids who struggled with reading were burning 7, 8, 9, 10 times as many calories in their brain. And nobody likes that. It was, it makes the process really unpleasant. I've compared this to like watching two swimmers. I'm a terrible swimmer, so this is a good metaphor for me. Watching two swimmers net side by side in doing laps, and they're swimming exactly the same speed, but one of them has got that graceful movement, the water's barely splashing. The other one looks like an explosion occurring in the water, but they're all going at the same speed. If I tell you that at the end of the lane, one of them is going to hold on to the edge of the pool and gasp for air, and the other one is going to do this graceful flip turn and swim back the other way, you know which one that is. And that's what happens to our kids. They're just clawing their way through the work, and then they get to the end of the paragraph or they get to the end of the page, and they just have to hold on and gasp for air because it takes so much effort. I know the answer to the question, but are we supporting these teachers well enough, both pre-service and post-service? I mean, clearly not. That's got to change. In your school districts, are reading specialists, let's assume that the reading specialists know what they're talking about and they're not adherents of the WSRA or similar groups like that, and let's assume they're really good experts in the science of reading. Are they available to middle school and high school teachers? Are reading specialists available in those buildings?
So my district, we do have reading specialists, only one at each of the high schools and only 3 at each of the middle schools. And it's a very affluent district with a lot of money.
Yeah.
Well,
Go
I was
ahead.
going to say, one of the ways that we can support the general educational teachers is actually help them with their technique. Far too often, general educational teachers do a lot of talking, and or allow the students maybe have to read the whole page. But if she would break it up and we half the page and discuss it, and then read the other half and discuss it, that will allow the students, one, to learn or use all of the literacy skills. At the same time, it keeps that sense of anxiety on that student who's reading. So you're giving them more time to actually just break that information up instead of trying to give it all in one big lump.
Yeah, and when we spot kids who are struggling to read, particularly in middle school and high school, I think we need to anticipate their shame and resistance. Because they're not going to come to you and say, "Oh yeah, I'm a really terrible reader. How can you help me?" They're trying to keep this hidden. They don't want people to know. And so anticipating that and breaking things up into manageable units for them, giving them more opportunities to discuss, to make those connections, I think is really, really important.
Yeah, in our school district, we have reading coaches and reading specialists at the elementary level. But at the junior high level, we literally only have reading coaches for our Title I buildings, and they're half-time. And then we have nothing for the high school. And it's like our district has put so many resources into the elementary, and then it's like junior high and high school get like very little resources at all.
In an ideal world, all these kids would be reading by 4th grade, and they would just need to keep reading and keep practicing, and everything would be great. And it's like the guy used to say in the Prairie Home Companion, Lake Wobegon, where all the all the men are strong, all the women are brilliant, and all the children are good looking. You know, I mean, that would be great. That would be wonderful. But that's not reality. You know, there's a lot of kids out there who are struggling. Even in the best districts, there are kids who are struggling.
And we also have to remember that the last 3 years with the pandemic,
Oh,
these third graders who are now sixth graders who are in the middle school, they really didn't have a strong foundation. So you really have to go back and realize that, you know, they had 2.5, maybe 3 years that you need to make up with in their instruction. So that's another reason why we need to kind of change the technique that we use when we present information in the classroom.
and we had kids, talking about the sixth graders who lost those years. We had kids showing up in second and third grade in live face-to-face school who had never been in live face-to-face school. This is a complete difference for them. You know, research, there's going to be researchers who make long careers by studying as we go forward what those COVID years did to kids based on how different districts approached it. Everybody was making the best decisions they could, but that's going to be studied just like wars are studied for what they did to kids.
I don't know if any of you have taken the letters like facilitator and there's those symposiums. So there was actually already a study done on like babies born during COVID and just the language they were exposed to. So that work's already been done. So there was a symposium on the letters stuff last year on that, if you haven't watched that one. I can't remember all the details, but there's already like a huge gap in language as well.
Yeah, and you know, the other thing that happens, I think one of the things we saw in COVID, you can teach over Zoom, you can do all you want, but some aspect of learning is having a close relationship with the person who's teaching you, and that relationship matters. And you can only have so much of a relationship with somebody over a camera, particularly when you're a little kid. COVID did do one great thing for the science of reading, though. Millions of parents sat at home, working from home, listening to their kids' lessons and listened to how they were being taught to read and said, what the? You know, they were like, whoa. So then when Emily Hanford sold a story, parents listen to that and go, that happened to my kid. I saw that happened. What the hell's going on out there? It really did accelerate the revolution and the awareness of what's going on, because parents saw it, they heard it, they were just outraged. What the hell's going on here? You know, I have some other interesting sort of examples from other professions. There's, you know, people want to specialize. I don't know if this is still the case, but until not that long ago, if you wanted to be licensed as a physician in Hawaii, among the things you had to do was you had to pass a test, regardless of your specialty. You had to pass a test showing that you understood how to recognize the signs of something called Hansen's disease, because Hansen's disease still occurred in the tropical environment of Hawaii. Anybody know what Hansen's disease is? It's known by another name, leprosy. And you needed to know how to recognize it. It's very treatable, but you wanted to recognize it sooner rather than later. I think that some of that may also happen in Louisiana, which is the other state in the United States that occasionally comes across cases of leprosy. These tend to be tropical, warm, humid places that these things happen. But it's an all hands on deck thing. You can't say, well, that's not my job, I'm a psychiatrist. Hell no, you're going to know how to recognize this in case you see it. Because we're never, you know, even if we implement the science of reading as well as we can everywhere, we are never going to get to a place that every kid is reading great in fourth grade and nobody needs extra help after that. And every kid in middle school and high school is doing great. We'll have more of them. We'll have fewer kids who are struggling. So we'll have fewer kids demanding of our time and our resources, but there's always going to be some. You know, we're never going to eliminate those. Reading is just too hard. It's never going to be where everybody can do it great. It really is quite difficult.
I
What other
wonder,
thoughts?
Steve, I
Go
wonder
ahead.
something, if you look at number 9,
Yeah.
page 29, was anyone blown away by the impact financially, right? So the economic impact that this has across the country. To me, I wonder why that hasn't led to more of I know, like with the reading first, we have the focus, and when it's just so simple, do you think it's because of publishing companies and universities trying to hold their money when the impact is so enormous economically? Why, where there's something that we
You
see
think
such a
that would matter
straightforward
more
answer
to
to, can we not find?
You think that would matter more to people, but we aren't that long in kind of cultural terms. We aren't that long past an economy where there was a need for people to do just kind of basic labor kinds of positions, where that was a big part of the economy. And you said, well, not everybody needs to read, we need garbage men and ditch diggers and all that, the same as everybody else. But there's so few of those jobs now, and even being a farmer, which used to be a close to the earth kind of thing, even being a farmer, you need to be able to read, you need to be able to understand things, you need to be able to do, to understand technology, and that's very difficult to do if you can't read well enough. I also see middle school and high school as being very plagued. They're paying a huge price for this myth that we still have in elementary schools, that he'll blossom in time. He just needs, in his own time, he'll come to it. One day he'll just wake up and he'll pick the right book and it'll be great. He's just not ready yet. When he's ready, and then they're in middle school and high school and they can't read. And we're saying, when the hell is ready going to happen? Do you think if elementary school teachers followed these kids along and saw that the light bulb doesn't just go on in their head, that they would appreciate, damn, I need to do more in elementary school? I was speaking about this to our local school board years ago when they didn't want to hear about it. And I was met in the hallway. I spoke before the meeting. And I went out in the hallway, and there was this mob of like 8 or 9 teachers walking towards me, clearly wanting to talk to me. And I thought, oh shit, this is how I'm going to die. These people are mad about what I said, and these teachers are going to kill me and dispose of the body, and I was really terrified. And they come up to me and they said, we're middle school teachers. You keep talking about this. These kids are coming to us and they don't know how to read, and we don't know what to do with them. We can't teach what we want to teach the way we want to teach it because a third of our class can't read the assignment. And I was relieved for one thing, because I didn't die that day in the hallway of our high school. But, I think that's true. And I wonder about more of a conversation between middle school and high school teachers and elementary teachers, because teaching middle school and high school is organized so differently than elementary school. It's almost like they're different worlds.
And everybody blames everybody else. I was a middle school teacher. I'd be like, oh my goodness, the elementary teachers, they didn't teach the kids. And then the high school teachers blame the middle school teachers. It's like everybody's like pointing a finger, blaming the other person.
And then the elementary teachers blame the parents.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And the parents blame the kids. My son struggled with long division when he was in middle school, and this math teacher said, I've got like 5 or 6 of these kids just can't do long division. She traced it back. They were all in the same 3rd grade class with a teacher who didn't teach it well and hated it. And they never came back to it. When it popped up in middle school, she had to take them all aside and teach them long division because they hadn't learned it. They could literally trace it back to one class.
out of respect of time, and also being a mom, and I have 3 kids that I need to put to bed. So I'm noticing some other guest appearances happening on these calls, which is great. We have about 10 minutes. So I don't know how we want to move forward. If we want to think of questions for like establish what week 2 is going to look like as we read chapter 2. Or if you've already read it, questions that you might want us to make sure we discuss, or some pieces of interest or things you want to address. And Steve, I want to just kind of put the time limit on your head, on your brain.
Yeah, and looking at the title of chapter 2, for those of you who haven't looked at it or read ahead, misconceptions about reading and their consequences. Somebody asked the question in the chat before, how do we get teachers to recognize the difference between science and folklore? That question is going to be central, I suspect, to the next chapter. We all believe things that aren't true. We believe them because we believe them. That's not unique to this question in this profession. People are good at that. We like what we believe. We believe what we believe. We don't really know why. I used to do some talks about things at work about my profession and professional stuff. And I would tell people, know what you think you know why you think you know it, and know that you could be wrong. And that's not easy. That's a challenging way to go through a profession. You don't want to sit there and say things, I could be wrong about this. Because nobody wants to think of themselves that way. Nobody wants to think of their expertise in those terms.
A couple other, I totally agree. And I think that as educators, that's something that is really incredibly important for us to always think about. Know that we may not, our content's great, or this, but we have to improve that in other areas. If you haven't had the chat up, there is a certificate of attendance if you would like to note that you are here. I don't know if your district does it, but mine is all about that flex PL. So those outward times that you're putting in can work in your favor. But it's also just good to help us connect with you through the Reading League, both Michigan and Wisconsin. I know that we collaborate pretty frequently, and that if you haven't signed up for our conference and you live in the area and you'd like to come to our various conferences or other webinars that we have, feel free to check out our websites. You will hear more from Steve. You will connect with more like-minded educators and practitioners, and build that bridge across Lake Michigan between ourselves and Michigan. So if there's other things you want to add into the chat, please do so. If there's questions or things to consider as we look into chapter 2, please let us know. Come with that. Maybe we'll have I hope this was a functional tool for us. Like, we didn't raise hands, but we all kind of unmuted, which I thought was a
really
nice collaborative discussion.
Headlining our second annual conference in October, the big headliner, we have Emily Hanford. So you can come and be in the same room with Emily Hanford, everybody's hero, everybody's heroine. But because I have teachers here, and because this is my chance to tell you the story, even though some of you have heard this story, I'm going to tell this story again because there's teachers here who have not heard it, I'm sure. There's a boy I worked with years ago, and I hadn't seen him in a couple of years, and he had grown, he was like 14 or 15. When I saw him again, I was at the Children's Detention Center in Milwaukee County, and he walked by a window, and he was very recognizable. And I came back the next day to check on him and see why he was there. And I said, "Why are you here? What happened?" And he told me, he says, "Oh, I found my parents." He had been, parental rights had been terminated, but he had accidentally ran into his parents. And he told me, I saw them and I showed up at their house and they took me in. I ran away from my foster home and I went to my parents. And I started to pass out. The blood started to drain from my head. My vision was closing in. I felt sick to my stomach because I knew him very well and I knew why he found his parents. When he was 12 years old, he was sure of one thing in his life, and that was someday he would find his parents and he would kill them. That was his plan. And so that he had found his parents, I was sure that he was in detention because he had killed them. And I asked him what happened, and he told me that there came a moment after he was there with them for a few days where they were passed out in bed from drugs and alcohol. And he was walking around their bed with a very, very large, sharp knife in his hand, deciding who he would stab first. He was ready to do it. And his mother was small and he was sure he could kill her easily, but his father was a big guy. And if his father woke up, he would stop him. He didn't want that to happen. So he knew he had to kill his father first, but his father would be hard to kill. And the phone was next to his mother's side of the bed. And if he got into it with his father, his mother would call the police, and he didn't want that to happen. He didn't want to get in trouble. So I asked him what happened. And he said, I put the knife away and I gathered up my things and I walked to the District 4 police station on Silver Spring Road, Silver Spring Drive in the north side of Milwaukee. And he turned himself in. And the only reason he was in detention was because he had a scheduled court appearance on a minor delinquency thing that was following him. And because he had run away and hid with his parents, he didn't show up for that. So they automatically issued a warrant for him. So when he showed up at the police station, they ran him for warrants and he came into detention for a few days while he straightened it out. And the blood went back to my head and I smiled and I was so glad he hadn't killed somebody. And I said, why didn't you do it? I know that's what you wanted to do. And he held up his hands like this, ignore the brace on my sprained wrist. He held up his hands like this. He folded his thumbs and he held up 8 fingers. And he said, because there's 8 people in the world I didn't want to disappoint. And the first person he named was Dennis Kozel, who was his child psychiatrist and is a good friend of mine and a wonderful man. He deserved to be on the list. The next person he named was me, and I remained very deeply touched by that. The next 6 people he named were all teachers. Teachers who I dare say would have thought he hated them, who didn't know they were that important. And teachers change lives. Secondary teachers, high school teachers, elementary teachers, you change kids' lives, you change the course of their life. Your relationship, their experience with you changes the course of your life. Those teachers saved lives. They kept him from doing this thing. His brother did kill some people, and is in prison for the rest of his life for something he did when he was 17. You know, we have kids all around us whose lives are hanging by a thread, and it's teachers who care for them and teach them and love them and put up with them and matter to them. They keep their heads, keep them afloat, keep them afloat long enough that they can learn how to swim for themselves. I have nothing but respect for what you do. I'm thrilled to have a chance to do some things that make it better. And I thank God for you all every day. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Steve, for leading. We'll see you all next week for chapter 2.
Yes, yes, yes. Bring your friends.
Yeah, share it. And it is recorded, so I can send it out and you can forward it on.
Very good. Take care, everybody.